also a love fest for the folks who are on the phone. I'm really big fans of many of your organizations, like Matt at True Fund. We've talked about Path 1555, and I've known Liff and Lisk and all these folks. So it's just great to see all of your faces in the place. And I also want to shout out Erica. So Erica has actually provided feedback on this process. And you guys, because of Erica's stewardship and leadership and so much, are probably way ahead of a lot of the folks that we have these conversations with. And so I just want to honor and acknowledge when we talk about there have been people in the field doing this work for a long time. Speaking truth to power, Erica is one of those folks. So just shout out and kudos to her. So I'm going to give you some context as we get into this work. And I want to share, a lot of the feedback. This is an open feedback loop in service of moving us towards a racially equitable society through just capital, if you will. And just starting off by acknowledging that integrating racial equity into investment strategies, like integrating racial equity into anything else, requires persistence and deep commitment, both at the organizational level and the personal level. And racial inequities, as you know, because Eric has been working with you, are not just something about people who are being racist or individuals or even individual institutions, but it's about a deep systemic set of choices across society, and not just in the United States. So one of the things that's been really powerful about working with the Global Impact Investing Network is that it's representative of countries across the world and not just the United States. And so it's born over centuries of very intentionally racist practices and policies. And so therefore we need very intentional practices to undo what has happened. And because it's been centuries of work to get here, if you will, one group we work with is called White Men for Racial Justice. And one of the participants, when they just stepped back and started to process all of the choices that led us to where we are today, started saying, wow, that's compounding injustice. So as you know, compounding interest grows over time. In the same way, our racist policies and practices that we have adopted across the globe have created compounding injustice. And we have to really work together consistently and tirelessly over time to undo all of that harm. And so when you think about the context of capital markets and capital flowing, as you know, people of color are often dramatically underrepresented, both as decision makers and as beneficiaries of the capital itself. And so that consistently uneven spread of capital is actually often the fuel that drives this unequal and unjust allocation and distribution of resources, outcomes, and tools. And frankly, oftentimes capitalism has served as a jet fuel for that. It continues to kind of push disparities forward. And so when you think about the IRIS Plus racial equity theme and its 3 strategic goals, it's really about trying to capture at the highest level how all of those processes and systems interconnect from a capital market standpoint. So the first goal around shifting power to address racial bias and ensuring equitable representation and decision-making. The next goal is around shifting the perception of risk through equitable deal sourcing, due diligence, and terms. And the last, which is really about driving and promoting racial justice, is about the so what. It's about increasing inclusive capital to create equitable outcomes for communities of color. Now, you may be familiar already from the great work of IRIS Plus, but these racial equity themes, these goals work differently than some of the IRIS Plus goals in the past, and that they're meant to be complementary, they're meant to be mutually reinforcing, and to work together on a path to achieving racial equity in capital markets. Now, when you think about IRIS Plus, oftentimes it's focused on what people would consider impact investors. But another thing that's different about these strategic goals is that they should apply to all investors, not just those focused on ESG, and not just those focusing on impact investing strategies, because of this compounding injustice. And we have to address that systemic bias that has had effects over time that without such paying attention to and prioritizing, it will continue to perpetuate and exclude groups due to race and or ethnicity. And so you can look at the IRIS Plus theme as a call to action and a guide to help investors intentionally integrate racial equity awareness and action in their investment strategies, portfolio decision, and evaluation of return on investment. The other thing when you think about racial equity, regardless of whether it's in capital markets or in other places, is that racial equity is really a combination of a diligent, intentional set of processes and a consistent set of rigorous evaluation of the outcomes, what happened as a result of those processes. Put another way, racial equity is both a process and an outcome, and investors can't have one without the other. And so when you think about the process-oriented changes we'll share today, our hope is that those will help promote greater equity in the organizations and in the operations. And that shift in having more equitable processes will actually help drive more equitable outcomes in communities that have been historically marginalized due to race and or ethnicity. Another kind of contextual backdrop for you is that the resources and recommendations included in these strategic goals are, as we mentioned before, informed by many actors, like Erica, we mentioned before, but it really is not about supplanting or duplicating work, but instead it's really about amplifying the work that so many leaders, including some of you on the phone potentially, have done for decades to close this racial wealth gap, particularly through capital and the distribution of capital. So we want to make sure that we raise that those resources are there and recommended to help inform using the work and the deep experiences of others to actually get to the place that we're looking to be to build an equitable society. So when you're an organization and you, as you're looking to kind of use this racial equity theme and you want to consider any part of these goals, you should think of them as a place to begin, wanting to make sure and you understand that you have to meet people where they are. For some folks, the place that they really want to dig into to start with might be around power and the individual journey. For others, it might be process and due diligence. But the goal is to start somewhere and end everywhere. You have to make sure that you're reinforcing all pieces and that they're integrated to make sure you're achieving the goals. Now, that's kind of a lot of context about the strategic goals, the thought process behind them, how they intersect with racial equity and what you're supposed to use them for. I want to actually step back as well and give a little bit of context about, as you're thinking about racial equity as a journey, especially within a global context, we want to make sure that we name that race and ethnicity are social constructs. They're specific to geography, they're specific to history, and I don't think we have enough time to actually capture in a respectful and thoughtful and thorough way that history for every country. But we want to use these as a starting point for folks and really show that if you want to use these, you can use them as specific examples that highlight the themes and approaches that investors can take to really make sure that they're addressing that systemic harm and marginalization because of race and ethnicity. So some of these goals and many of these examples that we've provided might be very US specific or US centric, no matter what we've tried or some of the input that we've received. But what our goal is to make sure we're using this to be very consistent and upfront about, we're not saying that means that race and ethnicity is not an issue in other countries. We're using this as a starting point and recommending that everyone in their global context does their own work, make sure that they really sit back and understand what the historical context is of their own populations that may have been basically historically marginalized due to race and or ethnicity. So it's not a one size fits all approach, but the specific examples we have can actually help guide you on the approach that you take based on your specific geography, your specific language, your specific background and history. And I think that to that last point, and is the part of the tension of pulling all of this work together, is that we're going to have to give each other grace and space and flexibility as we're working together towards an equitable society and a just society. And so we're hoping that in this process, as you translate this work in a way that actually applies the most to your own context, we can all provide each other a little grace. So that's a lot of caveat, context, background, but I'm hoping that kind of sets the stage as we get into the specifics. So I'll open it up for questions at the end so we can get through all of the pieces. But what I will encourage you now is throughout this conversation, and we're going to kind of give you the frame and the context to start, write yourself little notes, jot yourself little questions as you go. So when we get to the Q&A period, which we hope is going to be the majority of our time together, you remember, oh shoot, I meant to ask Ty about this. So please, 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 as Lissa said, this is really hopefully an open dialogue. All right, so now let's get into a little bit more detail about each of the strategic goals, and just a little bit, so we have time for your questions. So first, when you think about power, and that concept of shifting power in order to make sure that capital is distributed equitably, some of the context, and I'm sure you've heard this from Erica, but it can't hurt to repeat it. I always talk like Kelly Clarkson's song, again and again and again. Sometimes got to keep hearing it to remember to keep like what we're fighting for and fighting against. So first of all, less than 1.3% of the $69.1 trillion that the US has in global assets are managed by women and people of color. And just 1% of those assets are managed by Black people. 69 trillion with a T. So I know you hear it, but it's like every time you just step back and you think about representation, distribution, equity, think of all of the homes that could be bought, the businesses that could have been started, the diseases that could have been cured. If there was just equitable distribution of the resources that aligned with the ingenuity and the power and the amazing folks who are of color, who are BIPOC across not just this country, but the world. So that's what we're fighting against when we're thinking about power. And why are people of color not represented in positions of power in capital markets? We have to be straightforward. And this is something that Erica is always very great about, and we appreciated her feedback. It's because we have a history, a global history, not just in the United States, of violence, of a denial of human rights. And often this was perpetuated by Western, predominantly white colonialists. These folks led slavery, stole land, and a lot of the biggest challenges when you think about capital markets and capitalist systems is the capital itself was used as a fuel to that growth. The capital itself was driven in a way to help achieve economic growth for some while breaking the literal bodies and ripping apart families for others. That is what capital has done in the past. That is the history of all of our capital. And so if you're managing an asset class, even if you're a CDFI, the history of the dollar that got to you is often, and those returns have often been built on the backs of people of color globally. And so we have to work together, as I mentioned in the front, to undo centuries of compounding injustice. And it has to start with that really harsh, really challenging, sometimes hard to swallow history that capital is not neutral. It's not a religion in and of itself that's above human behavior. Capital actually is driven in a way that often reflects the human behavior. And sometimes that human behavior, is driven by a set of principles, factors that we don't want to acknowledge. And the great thing is today we are, and over the last few months with Erica and everyone else, you have been too. So when we think about power, that is what we're undoing. And it's very important that we're really clear about that. So as you think about that, and we acknowledge those individual and institutional biases that are embedded in the very systems that allow some people to have access to capital and others not to, the IRIS Plus strategic goal provides some concrete places to start. And so you'll see on the screen, I did little screenshots of each of the sessions. I'm going to, towards the end of this conversation, open it up to show you a little bit more how you navigate the system. But when you think about, well, how do I take that historical background and change it and be very intentional about undoing racist systems? It's a combination of having very clear goals, which you'll see there's increased investment in communities of color, increased staff actions to increase equity within the organization. These are very clear outcomes that you're looking to drive as you're addressing this strategic goal of power. And then behind each of these outcomes, there's a set of resources, very detailed data, resources in terms of evidence behind each one of these outcomes. Why do we say of all the things to do if you're going to shift power, that you should focus on increasing understanding of the interpersonal, institutional, and structural racism? You'll see when I open the system, there's an evidence base behind that. And so one of the great things about this platform is it kind of aggregates all of this information in one place and really allows you to kind of navigate if this is the outcome I'm trying to get to, why am I choosing this? And then also, if you see underneath, there's a set of metrics, right? So for each one of these goals, you will see some metrics repeat, but a lot of the metrics and the outcomes are specific to the goal as well. So it's everything from, what's the percent of assets under management that are distributed to communities and people of color? Or, do you have an actual racial equity strategy? So it gives you both a really high level goal that you can work towards, and then a set of metrics to help you hold yourself accountable to, recognizing, as we said, it's going to be grace, it's going to be a set of learning, and it's going to be a feedback loop. And then when I go into the system, I'll show you that underneath each of these, there's also ways to measure them. So that's an example of, that's a little background of power. And now we're going to shift to risk. And I'll give you a little bit of background on that. So when you boil down risk to its most basic concept, risk is not one of these innocuous things. Of all the things I think in capital market, risk is the one that's the trickiest. It's because people are like, whoa, we just have a system and we put it in the system and we got the criteria and then we got the information back and I can't, I'm just following what the system says. When you really boil down risk, it's not as innocuous as it sounds. Risk and the way risk is defined, whether by criteria, whether by processes, whether by policies, is really a reflection of the belief of who is and is not worthy of investment. And so that reflection of human behavior and belief is often masked in a set of policies, processes, scores, practices that seem objective, but those processes are often written, driven, created in a way that is reflecting a bias. And so the restricted definitions of risk based on that bias, that's what's often driving the marginalizations of certain racial and ethnic groups throughout history. That's what actually allows people to step back and remove themselves instead of, as we often say, being proximate to the problem, allows them to remove themselves from the fact that they're actually perpetuating harm by saying, oh no, I haven't been biased. I've just been following my process. And hey, this was a fair process. It's the same process we provided to this group as the other. What that process looks like in practice, however, is requiring land as collateral from people whose land was stolen. It looks like assessing people's creditworthiness based on an individual's subjective belief in character, not objective, subjective. It looks like investing in people from white dominant culture based on potential, which happens all the time and which you see research on, but instead investing in BIPOC communities based on proof. These are what these processes continue to perpetuate. And it's why you're not seeing the capital gap close, because not only is it continuing, but it's growing. And so when you look at the IRIS Plus details behind this, it's really to start to name and address. And I think for a lot of folks, that's probably one of the hardest ones sometimes to navigate within their systems, because there's such a false belief that they're objective. So it's things that really digging into, are your investment processes equitable? Are you actually getting equitable outcomes through these investment processes? How much capital is allocated to BIPOC founders and leaders of color? And so using those really clear outcomes at a high level, and once again, having specific metrics underneath it. And not just the assets under management, which you'll see come up over and over again, because the so what often is of if capital is distributed equitably is, are BIPOC people receiving that capital? That's often foundational. But other things like, what kind of investment terms are you using and are they biased? Are you engaging stakeholders themselves in the way that you're selecting who is and isn't reflective or worthy of this capital? And so pieces like that. So once again, you'll have very clear outcomes and very clear metrics as a part of the work. So if we go to the very last one of the goals around justice, and you think about what has been the results of this lack of investment in communities of color over centuries, it's been inequity. Like, this is why, in many ways, we're getting inequitable outcomes. Because even if you change policy, and this is capital P at a federal level, if you can't fund it, you can't fuel it, right? So if the funding is still fueling in an unjust way, we really have to not just focus on our processes, which power and risk in many ways are. Power, you think internally, risk, you think internal, external. But what's the so what of that result of capital? It is about really addressing the inequities that frankly span education, health, and employment. It spans cities, it spans regions, it spans countries, it spans continents. And if we're honest with ourselves, this capital investment is often what is driving this set of unjust outcomes more and more rapidly than we often feel that we can hold our arms around. And so that's why it's great that there are people like you who are working so diligently to address how capital flows in the systems that you touch directly to be able to address that. And so it's really important for us to make sure that we interrogate and intentionally address the internal and explicit bias within ourselves and our institutions and our processes. But we can't lose sight that the ultimate goal is that when that capital lands, we have to channel it in a way that's driving and creating an accelerant to racial justice and an equitable society. So when you think of the IRIS Plus system here, you really is moving beyond a set of outcomes that are just about doing no harm. And if you look at the set of goals there, it's not actually just about the capital when we look at the IRIS Plus goals. And Lissa has it on the screen now, great. It's really about seeing whether or not that this justice goal is confronting the dissonance within investors' portfolios to make sure that they're divesting from industries that have extracted health and wealth from communities of color for centuries. And it recommends not just an intentionality, but a proactivity in the long-term impacts that result from the investment. So when you look at that and you see what that means in practice, that's why there are things in there about increasing industry advocacy campaigns around racial justice, because no matter how big your investment is, you need to do that with the intentionality of, okay, are we driving this not just for us, but are we a voice and are we working actively in the field towards this? That's why it's talking about tracking and disaggregating data by race and or ethnicity in the result of your investment. So if you are investing in something that's supposed to advance education, are the outcomes actually equitable? So that's why it starts to get into things that some people might think of, oh, wait, we're capital investors. Why are we talking about advocacy? Or why are we talking about adoption of equitable policies and practices at a macro level? It's because the ultimate result is that, and we have to keep our eyes on those equitable outcomes. And so there are types of metrics underneath that are comparable to the pieces that we saw before, but once again, you'll see ones that are very specific around broader community engagement strategy, not just for the stakeholders that you're investing in directly, but broadly. Who's supposed to be the intended beneficiary of the result of this capital? And is it actually landing in that way? Or how are you actually working on policy and advocacy efforts that affect the capital that you're deploying? So that is just a really, really, really high level overview of power, risk, and justice. And we're going to open it up to questions. So before we get on questions really quickly, I'm going to just show you a brief overview of the system so you can see how to get to those screenshots I showed you. So if you look at this, and I'm going to blow it up so you can see it, the link, and I'll put it in the chat after I show you this really quickly, but the link, actually, Lissa, maybe you can put it in the chat. So there's a Navigating Impact project for IRIS Plus. If you go to scroll down and you will see racial equity, which is here, and you click on that. Those three goals that I was talking to you about, increasing inclusive capital, shifting power, shifting perception, this is those three strategic goals I mentioned. And then let's click on one. So I want you to have an opportunity to just kind of see how to get there. So overall, that opening that I gave you in the context is in the document. So you'll be able to kind of share that when you talk to others. And I really like to navigate it from this bar at the top. So when you think about, okay, great, well, what is the evidence that's backing shifting power? And you click on that. When you select the outcome or impact, and let's say we want to say, what is the set of evidence that talks about increased investment in communities of color? When you click on that, it shows all of these different studies that have focused on what happens when you increase the impact or investment in communities of color. And each one of these, one of the things that's awesome about GIIN is they're incredibly rigorous. So each one of these studies have a rigor associated with it. And I'm spending time showing you how to navigate the system. Part of the reason why is depending on where you are in your journey, you might have certain board members who are like, well, why are we picking that? Or you might have certain people who you're working with who are like, well, what's the evidence base behind it? And the great news is it's all here. So then once you have kind of deciding, well, what outcome are we going to pick to advance? Where are we going to start when we're thinking about shifting power or moving one of these things around risk? Once you pick your goal, how do you measure? So you can pick any of these metrics. There's a list of metrics underneath that. And once again, from this navigation bar, if you click the core metrics, it would take you here. So if let's say we picked on this one, number and percent investment committee members from groups historically excluded due to race and or ethnicity. If you click on that, not only does it give you a metric, but it gives you comments that we heard from feedback on, hey, when you're starting to collect this metric, these are some things you should think about as you're holding it. And this is what it should stand for. And this is what we mean as a definition. And this is how you would calculate it. So it's really supposed to help guide you to have some consistency. It also tells you why we included it. So really kind of giving you kind of a one-stop shop once again on how to think through the metrics and the data and the goals. And the last piece is some people don't really think in terms of metrics and data, or some people don't think in terms of evidence. Some people think in terms of stories or case studies. And so this last menu item here, find resources, shows a whole host of different examples, stories, case studies, that you can pull from that talk a little bit more about this work. And so you might have an investment member or a board member who just was like not getting it. And you can find a resource here and say, well, you know what, maybe you can read this article that was written by, Erica on why this is important. So that's just a quick guide. And so this same kind of setup on the system is the same across all of the different goals, even though the data behind it is different. Whew, that was a lot. So hopefully you have at least a sense of the racial equity theme. Thank you for the claps I'm getting. And now I want to open up to you. What questions do you guys have based on all of that talking I had at you? Recognizing that I might not be the experts, you might have the expertise in the room, but at least want to hear you guys questions and see and have the conversation going.
We have one in the chat. Is this live or is it a beta?
It is. Well, Lissa, why don't you answer?
So it is live. Everyone can go ahead and use it. We are a standards organization, so there's a long process to get it to the final. What that means, though, is that we have this kind of prototype published, meaning that everybody can look at it, they can play with it. Starting on hopefully November 30th, we're actually going to go to a broad public comment. So like open comment, give us all the feedback. If you are trying some of these things out and you found, hey, there's this tool that folks should use to do this particular one, or this metric sounds great and is really hard to do in practice, and here's what we've learned in that process. We want to hear all of that. And so at the end of this, and actually I'll chat it right now, there is a link here for those of you who haven't yet been involved in this process. If you go there and type your information and then racial equity theme, I'll make sure that you get an invite to this one in particular once we go live with that public comment period. So that'll be open for about 2 months after November 30th.
Awesome. And I just want to say thank you for the folks. Now that I've finished presenting, I can see the chat. So I'm so glad that folks are finding it. Thank you, Anna, for your comments, and Jessica and Becca and everyone who's mentioned something. Do folks have other questions? Let's see. Catherine has a question. So Catherine, you want to understand more about how it gets used and hopefully encourages investment that supports racial equity. So why don't we, Lissa, why don't you start with how it gets used, because you can share what happens in the past with the other themes. And then I can chime in on anything about the racial equity if that helps.
Yeah, so we see it being used in a number of different ways. Maybe I'll highlight 2 main use cases, but there are a lot of them. So the system is once it's on Iris Plus, it's all free, publicly available. So we get a lot of different users. Investors might come to the system to start to think about what their internal KPIs should be, what they want them to be. The system's set up, the strategic goals, the way that they're set up is designed to help with theory of change building. So folks sometimes come here as they're starting to build out or refine a theory of change and then connect that to metrics and approaches. The system also allows for something that I think is really cool and is the reason that we see a lot of companies or investee companies themselves using the system, which is that they can also set up strategic goals, and there's a share button built into the system. So if you wanted to work with investees or either way, either you set it up or they set it up, and be able to share back and forth what the strategic goals and the metric sets that you're thinking about. That's been a very cool way that we've seen folks use it for conversation versus like a statement. Folks will then often use the metrics themselves for reporting. And then, yeah, maybe there's so many other ones, but I think those are some of the main ones, and I can share more as we go along. We also have some use cases. Maybe I'll drop that into the chat as well, as to how people use the data then to make investment decisions, not on the racial equity strategic goals, because those are in the process and aren't fully live, but I'll give some other examples.
And then in terms of how it's designed to drive racial equity, if you remember the things I was saying at the beginning, it's a combination of the process and the outcome, right? So one is about building equitable processes. And so everything that's in the system comes from examples or case studies of work that we've seen happening already that's been effective. So a great example that folks might have heard before is the University of Chicago under the basically bugging and pestering of John Rogers from Ariel Capital Management, who's on the board of trustees. And he said kind of tongue-in-cheek that the only reason they were listening to him is because Valerie Jarrett was coming to visit and wanted to know how they were doing on equity. And so they had to trot him out as a board member. Really pushed about a decade ago a series of decisions that they made as an institution to drive more racial equity in their procurement and their investing and who they invested in as communities of color on kind of a comprehensive scale. And so since they have a decade's worth of work behind that, they've been able to see that their investments have outperformed actually their traditional fund managers that they've worked with. They're also seeing that it's landing in ways that are more equitable in communities. And so what the set of resources are doing is kind of distilling those practices into a set of goals and metrics that we've seen work in other places, along with sharing practices that do that. And so that is what the goal is, to kind of drive equitable outcomes. It's basically distilling all of these case studies that we're seeing in a way that you can take those metrics on and actually help drive those same outcomes for however you're integrating the work. Would you add anything, Mahlet, on that? Awesome.
Nailed it. Thank you.
Boom. All right. So someone had asked before a question about who they expect to use the tool. Do you feel like Lissa answered that question, or is there a follow-up question on that one? I think Jessica, that was you. So Jessica, I saw you nodding your head. So your thumbs up, awesome. Yay. We already sent you your note, Anna, so that's awesome. Let's see.
Matt has a question.
Thank you, Mahlet. Does this tool allow comparison of metrics in terms of effectiveness in achieving a goal? Can you give us a little bit more, Matt, just to make sure that we're answering it appropriately?
Yeah, so sort of part of this working group's what we're focusing on is the ability at some point to be able to assess the relative impact of any given investment that we make or we ask someone else to make in achieving a certain set of outcomes or a certain outcome. And so, you know, you've got different metrics, which obviously relate to sort of policies or decisions that are connected to, you know, achieving a particular goal. And I'm just wondering, again, is there any way to sort of say, oh, well, if you've got $1 to invest and you want to achieve this goal and you have these 3 interventions, you know, this one will give you the biggest bang for the buck.
So Lissa, before I answer Matt directly, thank you, Matt. Do you have any feedback from how you've handled that and other of the themes before they make it to the final system on the biggest bang for the buck outcomes?
I think that is the $1 million question that we hear all the time. So the system itself doesn't have a base of data built in to do any sort of threshold analysis. The metrics, well, I'll say that some of them would be set up well to do that if folks wanted to compare within them. We are doing some work on financial inclusion and quality jobs and some other spaces around how actually, like, how you have to do the math in order to do a reasonable comparison across a number of different spaces. I can share a link to that work. It's not specific to equity yet because we want to get our feet under us and make sure that we're doing it well and responsibly before we really dive deeply there. And as some of you in this group know, we're thinking really deeply about how to weave lenses in kind of from the beginning rather than treating them as a separate conversation, I guess. That said, some of the metrics are set up for that. Others are probably not well positioned to do that. Like some of the stuff about your own journey and the trainings that you're providing for folks and whatnot might be more useful for an internal management tool than an external comparison tool, would be my thinking there. But Ty, what do you think?
Yeah, I would say so. I would also say, and Lissa can correct me if I'm wrong because she's the czar of this, and this is also part of the public comment, part of the reason for the public comment period. So and this, Jackson might answer a little bit of your question too about like where do you source the studies, where did you source the processes? So some of it was research, but a lot of it was we engaged over 180 different players and actors in the field across the world, right? Like we had folks on from Brazil, we had folks on from Asia, we had folks on from London. We're doing process like this that are pressure testing it. And then, like I said, GIIN has really rigorous standards on, if this is something that's going to be on an outcome level for this goal, we have to have a level of evidence based on NESTA. So each one of those resources that you saw, if you were paying attention, you might have seen like a little icon that had a star next to it, and that shows the level of rigor of the study behind why this outcome was selected. I think, Matt, what will happen over time if the public comment period works well is that you'll start to whittle down the metrics potentially on, okay, these are the biggest bang for your buck. But I think the other piece is from doing kind of cross-sector collaborative work for a while that has really high level, big arching goals. The most important thing is to center on those goals. What are the results you're trying to see? And thinking of the metrics as kind of little breadcrumbs that tell you if you're on your way there. So the goal is not at all to say you have to have used all of these metrics. The goal is to say, have you hit these outcomes overall, and which metrics are helping you get there, and which things should you have in place to help you get there? Anything you'd add, Lissa or Mahlet?
It's right on. We have just a couple more minutes, and I want to make sure we get to Elisa Frazier's question, if I hope I'm pronouncing your first name correctly, and also to Brian Gursky's question as well.
Perfect. So I think so how do you envision this showing up in the CDFI industry? I think a similar way, what are the outcomes overall? I know CDFIs are in fact, actually, if you look in the system, we raise CDFIs as a really important and critical group of leaders, institutions who are advancing this work. But when you think about things like, are you actively advancing racial equity policy? One of the things that CDFIs are often hamstrung by is CRAs, right? And the CRA policies and what you can and can't do, or the fact that even banks or other folks add additional and hamstring your capital often. So in some ways you can use this tool as CDFIs as a way to reflect back, you might have some biases in your processes, or you might have some biases in the way your power structure is. And now this is like a third, use the system as the bad guy in some way and to change behavior upstream, because I know that's often, CDFIs are often getting squeezed from both sides as a result, squeezed regulatory and squeezed from some of their other capital. And I think Mahlet, you said there was one more question I should answer before we have to go.
Yep, Brian Gursky's question is about how do we actually use this to move the needle? And I can share a little bit about our standards effort and our investor blueprint for racial equity. And then Mike also has a great point, Lissa, that you may want to talk to around how else are you building on-ramps for other investors to get this even beyond the very wide network that the GIIN already has? Brian, to your question, this is just the beginning of how we intend to engage with the investor community and really set a framework for how we can start moving in a much more meaningful way, in a much more unified way. And so that Corporate Racial Equity Alliance initiative that I shared with you is all about standard setting right now on racial equity. And building on this incredible work with the GIIN, we aim to develop an investor blueprint for racial equity, similar to how PolicyLink and other partners have developed a CEO blueprint for racial equity. And in that investor blueprint, we aim to set targets. So in addition to these metrics and indicators, actual thresholds of this is where you should be, and then create a movement out of that. It's still very early days. But you're exactly right. We do need to push even harder and get all investors to be thinking about this and knowing that investments are either driving equity or inequity, not doing both, as you've heard a little bit already. And so getting everyone moving in that direction. Lissa, over to you if you want to can address Mike's question on other things we're doing.
I think both of you covered it. I think to the extent that we can find places and spaces to share, just like this one, we're excited about those, and we'll continue trying to push it out in any different ways that we can think of. But if you all have ideas or places where we might want to add this or just get it out to a wider network, please let us know. We're learning and growing as we go, and welcome any help you can give us in that process.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. And we always like to kind of end with a action commitment instead of next steps. So I think the main one we have to start is, what is one action you will take to apply a racial equity lens to your investments? So if you guys wouldn't mind putting that in the chat, and I'll give everybody a little bit of time on that before I turn it over to Lissa to share for what the next steps are, which I think you kind of mentioned a little bit already, but see if you have others that you want to, anything else you want to add for next steps.
Okay, now you can hear me. Yeah, so the next step for us is to go to public comment. That means that while we have been really, really lucky to work with Ty and her colleague, Tracy Jarman and Mahlet, and a number of her colleagues and my colleagues, Grace and Kellen, as well as about 180 different individuals from different organizations and angles in building this so far, that is only a fraction of this industry. And so we're going to push it to public comment pretty soon. And at that point, would love your ideas, your notes on what works, what doesn't work, what's been tricky, what's been surprisingly helpful, all of that. I'll drop that chat again in or that link here. If you are interested in being a part of the conversation and getting an invite to that public comment, just sign up there, write in racial equity, and we'll make sure that that gets to you. I would also mention, though, that both PolicyLink and CapEQ are working on some really big initiatives right now as well. And Ty, I wonder if you might drop in past the 1555, and Mahlet, I know that you shared the Corporate Racial Equity Alliance work, but just flagging that both of them may have things coming up that you should keep an eye out for. And for any other questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'll also chat my email address here. And thank you.
Thank you guys so much. I'm going to turn it over to you, Mike, to close us out. But we really appreciate being here.
Oh gosh, I was just trying to type my response to your question in the chat, but I'm only halfway through. Well, I was just going to say one thing that I'm excited. So Impact Frontiers doesn't manage investments, and my personal investments are too small to be consequential. But what I'd love to explore by the way of mainstreaming into Impact Frontiers is to just share this work not only with the CDFI cohort, but with the other cohorts that we're working with, providing them your contact information, pointing them to your work. So that's one thing that I would love to do. I think you can see from the response how enthusiastic folks are about your work and about this great resource. And I don't have anything to add to that. I'm just very grateful for your leadership and for this great new resource, and grateful to you for making time to come and share it with us.
Thank you.
Anything else from anybody else? Let's have a round of applause for these leaders. There we go.
Thank you.
And we'll give another couple of minutes for folks to type in their comments. I will say we're being very timely because we're actually going right now into another session at 3 p.m. Eastern, decomposing drivers of portfolio risk. And we've talked a lot about unpacking the dynamics of what emerges as looking risky or being risky. And so I feel like it's just such a timely coincidence that we happen to have this session immediately preceding that one. So thank you for that as well.
You're welcome. Awesome.
Erica, do you want to, yeah, there's Erica. Erica, would welcome any thoughts from you as well.
Oh, no, I'm just so proud of this work, and had conversations with Lissa, like it seems like a few months ago, but it was over a year ago at this point. And the way that it has all come together with so much input, and actually again building the learning into the doing has just been phenomenal to watch it all unfold. And it's a resource that is long overdue, and I do just want to emphasize the fact that this is new for how people think about their approach to investing and decision making. So thank you for including me in the process to get here, and I hope everyone finds it really useful. And actually, I was just about to send Mike a note that the spreadsheet for the organizational assessment. Actually, this is inadvertently really good timing to put that out. So I will share that with everyone right when we get off of this call, so that you can start to reflect on some of the questions in that assessment and the context of what it is that we just heard today. So hopefully that is going to be useful for some additional thinking. But you all done phenomenal work. So just happy to be a part of it as well.
Thank you.
Thank
All
you,
right.
everyone.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. We really
Thanks,
appreciate
everybody.
it.
Have a great rest of your days.
Bye.